My name is Savannah Parker. I was 21 years old and 6 months pregnant when my own family left me alone in the Arizona desert. Even now, saying those words out loud feels unreal. The heat that afternoon was overwhelming. The sun hung high above us, turning the empty landscape into a sea of dust and shimmering air. My parents had told me we were taking a short family drive to clear our heads after weeks of tension at home. I wanted to believe them. Things had been difficult since they learned I was pregnant, but part of me still hoped we could find our way back to being a family. That hope disappeared the moment my father pulled the SUV onto a deserted dirt road. We stopped in the middle of nowhere. My mother turned toward me with a forced smile. "Why don't you get out and take a short walk, Savannah? Fresh air might help." Something about her voice felt strange. Before I could ask questions, my father unlocked the door. I stepped outside. The dry air immediately hit my face. I took a few steps away from the vehicle and turned around. The SUV was already moving. At first I thought they were joking. Then I thought they were turning around. Then I realized neither of those things was true. The vehicle kept going. My mother never looked back. My father kept both hands on the steering wheel. My older sister Madison sat in the back seat staring straight ahead. Within seconds, the SUV became a dark shape in the distance. Then it disappeared completely. I stood there frozen. 6 months pregnant. No phone. Almost no water. No idea where I was. No idea how far the nearest town might be. That was the moment everything changed. I wasn't lost in the desert. I was left there. And the people who abandoned me were the same people who had spent my entire life pretending they loved me. When people looked at the Parker family, they saw success. We lived in a beautiful neighborhood outside Phoenix. Our house sat on a quiet street lined with tall trees and perfectly maintained lawns. My father, Michael Parker, owned a successful investment company. My mother, Linda Parker, served on charity boards and appeared at nearly every major community event. From the outside, we looked like the kind of family people admired. Inside the house, things were very different. Love was never given freely. Love had to be earned. And somehow, no matter how hard I tried, I never earned enough. My older sister Brooke was the golden child. She was smart, confident, and ambitious. Teachers praised her. Neighbors admired her. My parents talked about her achievements constantly. At family dinners, conversations revolved around Brooke's accomplishments. When she won awards, my parents celebrated for weeks. When I accomplished something, they barely noticed. I remember bringing home a painting that had won a regional student competition during high school. I was excited. It was the first time my work had been recognized outside of school. My mother looked at it for less than 10 seconds. "That's nice, Savannah," she said. "But have you thought about a career that offers real stability?" The conversation immediately shifted to Brooke's debate tournament. Moments like that happened all the time. Little by little, I learned that my dreams mattered less. My opinions mattered less. Eventually, it felt like I mattered less. I became the quiet daughter. The daughter who stayed out of the way. The daughter who stopped expecting praise. Deep down, I still wanted my parents to be proud of me. I still hoped one day they would look at me the way they looked at Brooke. But some people spend their entire childhood chasing approval that was never meant for them. I did not realize it then, but the distance between me and my family had been growing for years. The pregnancy would simply expose what had always been there. Everything changed when I met Tyler Brooks. I met him during my second year of college. He was not the kind of person my parents would have chosen for me. He did not come from a wealthy family. He was not studying law or finance. He worked part-time at a local coffee shop while finishing his degree. But Tyler had something I rarely found around my family: kindness. He listened when I talked. He respected my opinions. Most importantly, he never made me feel like I had to earn his approval. For the first time in my life, I felt accepted exactly as I was. Then came the news neither of us expected. I was pregnant. The moment I saw the test results, my entire world seemed to stop. I was scared. Tyler was scared too. We spent hours talking about what came next. Neither of us had a perfect plan, but we agreed on one thing. We would face it together. At least that was the plan. A week later, Tyler stopped answering my calls. His phone was disconnected. His apartment was empty. His social media accounts disappeared. It was as if he had vanished overnight. I was devastated. Months later, I would learn the truth. My father had met with him privately. Michael Parker offered him money to leave and never contact me again. And Tyler accepted. I wish I could say that discovering this made me angry. The truth is, it mostly made me sad. Because by then, I had already learned how little control I had over the situation. When I finally told my family about the pregnancy, the reaction was even worse than I expected. My mother cried, not because she was worried about me, because she was embarrassed. My father sat silently, staring at me with disappointment. Brooke looked annoyed, as if my pregnancy had somehow inconvenienced her personally. For days afterward, nobody spoke to me unless absolutely necessary. The atmosphere inside our home became colder with each passing week. I felt judged every time I entered a room. I felt unwanted every time someone looked at me. Eventually, I realized something painful. My family was no longer trying to help me. They were trying to protect themselves. And in their eyes, I had become a problem they desperately wanted to erase. About 2 weeks before the desert trip, I stopped feeling like a daughter and started feeling like a problem everyone wanted to solve. The silence inside the house changed. My parents began having private conversations behind closed doors. Phone calls happened late at night. Whenever I entered a room, discussions ended immediately. Nobody explained anything. Nobody included me. At first, I thought they were simply embarrassed. Then one night, I learned the truth. I could not sleep. The baby had been moving constantly, and my mind refused to settle down. Around midnight, I walked downstairs to get a glass of water. As I passed my father's home office, I noticed the door was slightly open. Voices drifted into the hallway. I recognized my mother's voice first. "Michael, are you sure this is the only way?" My father's answer came immediately. "It has to be done." There was a long silence. Then Brooke spoke. "Once she is gone, everything goes back to normal." My stomach tightened. Gone? What did that mean? I moved closer to the door. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear. My father continued speaking. "Nobody will ask questions. People already think she's unstable. They'll assume she made a bad decision and disappeared." My mother sounded nervous. "And if someone finds her?" "They won't," my father replied. "The location is too remote." A cold wave rushed through my body. Location? Remote? Suddenly, every strange conversation from the past 2 weeks made sense. This was not about helping me. This was not about protecting me. They were planning something. Something deliberate. Something terrifying. Brooke laughed softly. Honestly, she created this mess herself. That sentence hit harder than anything else. Not because it was cruel. Because she genuinely believed it. I backed away from the office door as quietly as possible. Every instinct told me to run. But I had nowhere to go. No money. No car. No support. For the first time in my life, I realized something that changed everything. I was no longer dealing with disappointment. I was dealing with people willing to sacrifice me to protect their image. The next morning, my father announced that we were taking a family drive. His voice sounded calm, almost cheerful. My mother smiled more than she had in months. Brooke sat at the breakfast table scrolling through her phone as if everything was perfectly normal. I knew something was wrong, but I also knew I could not show them that I knew. So I played along. I nodded. I smiled. I acted grateful. Inside, I was terrified. A few hours later, we climbed into the SUV and left the city behind. At first, the drive felt ordinary. We passed shopping centers, neighborhoods, and gas stations. Then the buildings became smaller. The roads became emptier. Eventually, there was nothing but desert stretching in every direction. Nobody talked much. The silence inside the vehicle felt heavy. Every mile increased the feeling that I was moving farther away from safety. After several hours, my father turned onto a narrow dirt road. Dust rose behind us. The landscape became even more isolated. No houses. No businesses. No other vehicles. Just endless desert. Finally, the SUV stopped. My mother turned toward me. "Why don't you get out and take a short walk, Savannah? Fresh air might do some good." Her smile never reached her eyes. I hesitated. My father unlocked the door. For a brief moment, I considered refusing. But fear froze me. I stepped outside. The heat was immediate and intense. The desert air felt like opening an oven door. I took a few uncertain steps. Then I heard the engine rev. I spun around. The SUV was already moving. At first, I thought they were repositioning the vehicle. Then it kept going. Faster. Farther. Away from me. I ran after it. I shouted. I waved my arms. Nobody stopped. Nobody looked back. Within seconds, the vehicle became a distant shape. Then it disappeared completely. The silence that followed was overwhelming. I stood alone in the middle of the Arizona desert. 6 months pregnant. With less than half a bottle of water. No phone. No map. No idea where the nearest town was located. Panic hit immediately. I started walking down the road. Then jogging. Then stumbling. The heat drained my energy faster than I thought possible. Hours passed. My water ran out. My legs felt weak. My head spun. Eventually, I collapsed beneath a small patch of shade beside a rocky hill. For the first time, I seriously wondered if I was going to die there. Then something happened. A strong kick pressed against my stomach. My baby. Another kick followed. Then another. I placed both hands on my belly and started crying. Not from fear. From determination. In that moment, I stopped thinking about myself. I started thinking about the little life depending on me. And I made a promise. No matter how hard this became, I was going to keep moving. I was going to survive. I do not remember every detail of what happened after that. The heat had already taken a toll on me. I walked for what felt like hours. Sometimes I stumbled. Sometimes I stopped and rested for a few minutes before forcing myself to continue. The sun slowly moved lower in the sky. As daylight began to fade, I noticed something in the distance. A building. At first, I thought it was a mirage. The desert was full of tricks. But the closer I got, the more real it became. It was a small roadside gas station. Old. Weathered. Almost forgotten. To me, it looked like salvation. By the time I reached the front door, I could barely stand. An older man behind the counter immediately rushed toward me. His name was Frank Miller. He asked no questions. He simply saw a pregnant young woman in trouble and helped. Frank called emergency services. Paramedics arrived shortly afterward. At the hospital, doctors treated my dehydration and monitored the baby. Thankfully, both of us were going to be okay. Physically, at least. Emotionally was another story. The following morning, a police officer came to take my statement. I considered telling him everything. But fear stopped me. My father had money, connections, influence. If my family learned where I was, I believed they would find me. So I made a different choice. I disappeared. With help from a social worker, I boarded a bus heading east. I left Arizona behind. I left my old life behind. And I left Savannah Parker behind. In a small town 2 states away, I rented a tiny apartment above a bakery. The place was cramped and outdated, but it was safe. I found work at a 24-hour diner and introduced myself with a different name. For the first time in my life, nobody knew who my family was. Nobody knew my past. Nobody expected anything from me. I was completely alone. Yet strangely, I felt freer than I ever had before. I thought the hardest part was over. I was wrong. A much bigger shock was still waiting for me. About a month after arriving in my new town, I learned something that changed me forever. I had just finished a long shift at the diner. My feet hurt. My back hurt. Everything hurt. I was sitting alone in my apartment eating a simple dinner when a news broadcast caught my attention. The reporter was standing in front of a house that looked painfully familiar. My house. The house where I grew up. Confused, I turned up the volume. The reporter spoke with a serious expression. The search for 21-year-old Savannah Parker has officially ended. Authorities now believe she is deceased. I froze. The fork slipped from my hand. For several seconds, I simply stared at the television. Then the broadcast shifted to footage from a memorial service. My memorial service. There were flowers everywhere. Family friends filled the room. Neighbors spoke about what a tragedy it was. Then the camera found my parents. My mother dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. My father stood beside her looking solemn. They looked devastated. Anyone watching would have believed they were heartbroken. The reporter approached them. My mother spoke first. Savannah struggled with many things, she said quietly. We only wanted what was best for her. My father nodded in agreement. We never stopped loving our daughter. The words made me sick, because I knew the truth. I knew exactly what had happened in the desert. Then the camera moved to Brooke. Tears rolled down her face. She talked about missing her sister. She talked about loss. She talked about grief. Every word was a lie. I sat there in silence long after the broadcast ended. For years, I had wanted their approval. For years, I had hoped they would love me. That night, something inside me finally changed. The family I missed did not exist. The people on that screen had already chosen who they were. I could not change them. I could not save them. And I no longer wanted their acceptance. For the first time, I stopped focusing on what I had lost. I started thinking about what came next, because if they could bury me with lies, then one day the truth deserved its own voice. 3 months later, my son was born. I named him Noah. The moment I held him for the first time, everything else faded away. The fear, the anger, the loneliness. None of it mattered as much as the tiny life sleeping in my arms. For the first few weeks, my entire world revolved around feeding him, protecting him, and learning how to be a mother. I was exhausted most of the time. Money was tight. Sleep was almost non-existent. But for the first time in years, I felt a sense of purpose. No one needed me. And unlike my family, he loved me without conditions. One night, after a particularly difficult shift at the diner, I sat with Maria, the owner. She had become the closest thing I had to family. Maria listened as I talked about my fears. What if they get away with everything? I asked. She looked at me for a moment before speaking. People like that always think they are untouchable. But the truth has a way of finding daylight. Her words stayed with me. Over the following months, I stopped seeing myself as a victim. I started seeing myself as a witness. Someone who knew what really happened. Someone who had survived. That shift changed everything. I bought a used laptop. Nothing fancy. Just enough to do research. At first, I was only curious. I searched public records connected to my father's business. Then I found something strange. A property transaction that seemed unusually complicated. Then another. And another. The deeper I looked, the more questions appeared. My father had built his reputation on honesty and professionalism. Yet many of his business dealings seemed designed to hide information. Shell companies. Complex ownership structures. Transactions that made little sense. Next, I looked into my mother's charitable foundation. The organization that had made her a respected figure in the community. What I found surprised me even more. Large payments. Unusual transfers. Financial records that raised serious concerns. Then I examined Brooke's role within my father's company. That investigation uncovered even more questionable activity. Piece by piece, a larger picture began forming. The perfect family image they had spent decades creating was built on secrets. And for the first time, I possessed something they could not control. Evidence. Not enough to expose them yet. Not enough to prove everything. But enough to make me realize one important thing. The truth was hiding in plain sight. I simply had to keep digging. By the time Noah turned 6 months old, I had spent nearly a year gathering information. Every spare moment went into research. When Noah slept, I worked. When I finished a shift at the diner, I worked. When I felt tired or discouraged, I reminded myself why I started. I was no longer doing this for revenge. I was doing it for accountability. The first move had to be small. I could not simply appear and accuse my family. Nobody would believe me without proof. So I started anonymously. Using public computers and temporary email accounts, I sent information to local journalists. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to encourage questions. One message highlighted unusual real estate transactions connected to my father's company. Another pointed toward questionable spending linked to my mother's foundation. Then I waited. For several weeks, nothing happened. I began wondering if I had wasted my time. Then one afternoon, while working at the diner, I noticed a news report playing on a television above the counter. A local reporter was discussing concerns surrounding a development project connected to my father's business. My heart nearly stopped. Someone had listened. The story was brief, only a few minutes long, but it was enough. A few days later, a local blog published an article questioning how certain charitable funds had been used by my mother's organization. More questions followed. More attention. More scrutiny. The cracks were starting to appear. For years, my parents had controlled every narrative. They controlled their image. They controlled public perception. They controlled how people viewed our family. Now, for the first time, they were losing that control. The pressure continued building. Reporters began requesting interviews. Community members started asking uncomfortable questions. Business partners became cautious. The perfect reputation my family had spent decades constructing was beginning to weaken. And the most important part was this: they had no idea who was responsible. As far as they knew, Savannah Parker was still dead. They were searching for enemies in boardrooms, newsrooms, and business circles. They never imagined the person pulling the first threads was a young mother living in a tiny apartment hundreds of miles away. The downfall had begun. And this was only the beginning. The situation changed completely when Rachel Bennett became involved. Rachel was not a local reporter. She was one of the most respected investigative journalists in the country. Over the years, she had exposed corrupt executives, dishonest politicians, and organizations that believed they were above accountability. Most importantly, she had a reputation for following facts wherever they led. One evening, after months of collecting evidence, I sent Rachel a carefully organized package. Inside were documents, financial records, public filings, and detailed explanations connecting everything together. I did not ask her to believe me. I simply asked her to look. A week passed. Then another. I heard nothing. Part of me assumed she had ignored it. Then everything exploded. Rachel published the first article in what would become a national investigation. The headline immediately attracted attention. Questions surrounding the financial activities of prominent Arizona business leader Michael Parker. Within hours, the story spread across multiple news outlets. By the end of the week, national media organizations were discussing the allegations. The investigation uncovered concerns about real estate transactions connected to my father's company. Questions emerged regarding financial practices inside my mother's foundation. Former employees began speaking anonymously. Business records were examined. Public officials were questioned. The story kept growing. Every day seemed to bring another headline. Then the consequences started. Several business partners publicly distanced themselves from my father. Investors demanded answers. My mother's foundation temporarily suspended operations while outside auditors reviewed financial records. Board members resigned. Donors disappeared. Even Brooke began feeling the pressure. Her professional reputation suffered almost overnight. Friends stopped calling. Former supporters suddenly became strangers. For years, my family had carefully built an image of success, integrity, and respectability. Now that image was collapsing in front of the entire country. I watched everything. From my apartment. Most nights, Noah slept peacefully beside me while news anchors discussed the Parker family. Sometimes I felt satisfaction. Sometimes sadness. Mostly, I felt relief. The truth was finally reaching daylight. But despite everything that had happened, my family still believed they could survive the storm. They still believed they could explain away the accusations. They still believed their biggest secret remained buried. Because as far as they knew, Savannah Parker was gone forever. They had no idea that the person behind their downfall was alive. And very soon they were about to find out. For months, my family had been fighting reporters, investigators, and growing public scrutiny. But they still had one advantage. They believed I was dead. I decided it was time to take that advantage away. I wanted them to know the truth. Not through a news report. Not through a lawyer. Personally, one afternoon, I printed a copy of Noah's ultrasound photo. It was one of the first images I had received after surviving the desert. A simple picture, but it represented everything they had failed to destroy. I placed it inside a small envelope, along with a handwritten note. The message was short: I am alive.
So is my son.
Then I mailed it directly to my parents' house. After dropping the envelope into the mailbox, I drove home and waited. The waiting was the hardest part. Hours passed, then a full day, then another. Finally, I received confirmation that the package had been delivered. I sat quietly on my couch staring at the notification. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what was happening inside that house. My father opening the envelope, my mother seeing the ultrasound, Brooke reading the note, the realization, the panic, the fear. Every emotion I had experienced in the desert was now finding its way back to them. Except this time, they were surrounded by comfort. They were safe, and still they would feel afraid, because the secret they had buried was no longer buried. The daughter they had abandoned was alive. The grandson they never expected to meet was alive. And somewhere out there, the person who knew all their secrets was watching. For the first time in their lives, they could not control what happened next. The ghost they thought was gone had returned. And the most important chapter of the story was still ahead. The final piece of evidence came from a place I had almost forgotten. A few years earlier, I had helped my father set up several digital systems for his business and personal vehicles. At the time, it seemed like a small favor. Now it would change everything. While reviewing old records, I discovered that one of the family vehicles had been equipped with a cloud-based recording system. The system automatically stored footage from important trips. Most of the files had been deleted over time, but not all of them. Buried among hundreds of recordings was footage from the day my family drove me into the Arizona desert. For several minutes, I simply stared at the screen. I could hardly breathe. Part of me wanted to close the file and never watch it. Another part needed to know. So I pressed play. The video showed the familiar drive, the empty roads, the desert landscape, the isolated dirt path. Then came the moment. The vehicle stopped. I stepped outside. A few seconds later, the SUV pulled away. The recording captured everything. Not just the vehicle leaving. It captured the complete absence of concern.
No panique. No hesitation.
No effort to return. The footage showed exactly what happened. A young pregnant woman left alone in the middle of nowhere. For years, my family had hidden behind explanations and carefully crafted stories. This recording removed every excuse. The evidence was undeniable. I spent several days considering what to do next. Eventually, I made my decision. The truth belonged in public. I provided the footage to Rachel Bennett and the authorities investigating the case. Once verified, the recording became impossible to ignore. News organizations across the country reported on it. Legal experts discussed it. Former supporters abandoned my family completely. Public opinion shifted almost overnight. What had started as questions about finances became something far more serious. Investigators expanded their focus. New interviews were conducted. Additional evidence emerged.
Soon
afterward, formal charges were announced. The story dominated headlines for weeks. I watched the coverage from my apartment with Noah sleeping beside me. There was no celebration.
No cheating.
No sense of victory. Only relief. For the first time since that day in the desert, I felt something I had not experienced in a very long time.
Safety.
Because the truth was no longer hidden. The world finally knew what happened. And no amount of money, influence, or reputation could put that truth back in the shadows. Nearly a year after the investigation began, I finally returned home. Not because I missed the place. Not because I wanted revenge. I returned because I needed closure. By then, Noah was a year old. He sat happily in his car seat as we drove through the same Arizona neighborhoods I once thought I would never see again. Everything looked smaller than I remembered. The streets, the houses, even the fears I had carried for so long. When I turned onto my old street, I barely recognized the Parker family home. The lawn was overgrown. Paint was peeling from parts of exterior. The house no longer looked impressive. It looked tired, almost forgotten. I parked in the driveway and lifted Noah into my arms. For a moment, I simply stood there. A year earlier, I had been fighting to survive. Now I was standing there holding the child they never wanted. Then I walked to the front door and rang the bell. Several seconds passed before it opened. Brooke stood there. She looked older than her years. The confidence that had once defined her was gone.
At first, she did not recognize me.
Then her eyes widened. The color drained from her face.
Savannah?
Her voice was barely above a whisper. Before I could answer, my mother appeared behind her. The moment she saw me, she froze. Tears immediately filled her eyes. A few seconds later, my father stepped into view. For the first time in my life, Michael Parker looked powerless. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The silence seemed to stretch forever. Finally, I shifted Noah slightly in my arms. He smiled and reached toward the doorway, unaware of the history standing in front of him. My mother covered her mouth. My father stared at his grandson without saying a word. I did not come to argue. I did not come to accuse. The courts would handle that. The media had already done its job. I came because I wanted them to see what survived. I survived. My son survived. And despite everything they had done, we had built a life without them. For a brief moment, nobody said anything. Then I turned around and walked back toward my car. This time, I was the one leaving. The difference was that I left with peace. The legal process continued for many months after that visit. Investigators completed their work. Evidence was reviewed. Witnesses testified. And eventually, the truth that had remained hidden for so long became part of the public record. My family's reputation never recovered. But by then, their reputation no longer mattered to me. What mattered was the life Noah and I were building. Today, we live in a small house with a backyard where he loves to play. It is not a mansion. It is not a symbol of status. But it is filled with something I never experienced growing up.
Peace.
Sometimes people ask if I hate my family. The honest answer is no. Hatred keeps you connected to the people who hurt you. And I spent too many years carrying that weight already. What I learned is much simpler. Some people will never become the parents, siblings, friends, or partners you wish they could be. Accepting that truth is painful, but it is also freeing. The desert taught me something I will never forget. Strength is not about never being afraid. Strength is choosing to keep moving forward even when fear is standing right beside you. The people who abandoned me believed my story would end that day. Instead, it became the beginning of a completely different life. A better life. A life built on honesty, resilience, and love. And every time I look at Noah, I am reminded that the greatest victory is not getting even with those who hurt you. The greatest victory is creating a future they never believed was possible. If this story touched you, let us know where you are watching from and what lesson stayed with you the most. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join Smart Revenge for more powerful stories every week.